So as you can see, my topic is very different from probably the other papers that you have heard in this conference, because I'm trying to do some kind of cross-regional analysis. I mean, before I start, let me begin by saying how come that I started to think about that. So I produced a book with my colleague Cas Mude. I'm mainly doing research on populist parties in Latin America, and he's doing populist parties in Western Europe and also in Eastern Europe. And we had the idea of organizing a workshop in which we invited people doing research on populism in the Americas, so North America and South America, and also in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And I found the exercise extremely interesting because what happened in that workshop was that many people at the beginning were doing research on Haider, for example, thought that Chavez has nothing to do with Haider. And after the workshop, we realized that in fact there are a lot of commonalities. So based on that experience, I thought that maybe there is something that we can learn from the Latin American experience with economic crisis. So, and of course, one big caveat of what I'm going to tell you, it's mainly speculations if you want, and I'm going to talk about two regions that are very big, and there are a lot of differences between these regions and also within these regions. So I assume that as soon as you're going to hear something, you're going to say, oh, but wait a moment, in Argentina that was different, or in Austria it's different. Of course, there are many exceptions to many of the trends that I'm going to present here, but nevertheless, I think that many of the ideas that I'm going to develop are, to a certain extent, valid for each of those regions. So let me start with one simple question is, what do we know about the impact of economic crisis on the political system? And let me briefly talk about the Latin American experience. So, and as you probably know, Latin America experienced a huge economic crisis at the beginning of the 80s. And in fact, that's the figure that you can see there. So economic growth of Latin American countries in the last 5 decades. As you can see, the decade between the decade of the 80s was a terrible decade for Latin America. And in fact, economists normally talk about the so-called lost decade. In fact, that's only the figure, the average for all the 10 years. But if you look at the year in which the crisis exploded, which is 1982, so then you have a huge recession in many Latin American countries. So at that period of time, Latin America was governed by authoritarian regimes, and in fact, one of the positive impacts of the economic crisis was regime change. It was not the only factor, but it was a crucial factor for understanding the transition to democracy in Latin America at that period of time. But I think what is also interesting is that many authors at that period of time, mainly Guillermo O'Donnell, who is one of the main theorists thinking about transitions to democracy at that period of time, many people and scholars were very worried about what is going to happen in Latin America precisely because of that crisis. And many scholars thought there are going to be too many expectations about these new democratic regimes, and it might be that these democratic regimes are going to be under stress, and precisely because of that, we are going to see a democratic collapse. But that did not happen in Latin America, and in fact, Latin American countries are quite stable. The only exception is probably Peru under Fujimori. It's a clear case of democratic collapse, but that's the only exception. And we have democratic regimes in Latin America since the beginning of the 1990s. So the first question then, or one of the first points is, how can we understand this democratic persistence in Latin America, although we know that the region has a history of economic shocks and rampant inequality? And if you look at the literature, there are mainly 3 arguments for understanding that. The first one is economic globalization. That's mainly theories developed by authors working with rational choice, like Boix and Acemoglu and Robinson. And what they are saying is, like, precisely because of economic globalizations, there are less pressures for economic redistribution. And because of that, we have, for example, left-wing governments, but these left-wing governments do not have too much room of maneuver for implementing radical reforms. The second explanation is external influences, and we know that the role of the US has changed a lot since the 1980s, and it's one of the main reasons why we have democratic stability, but also the whole neighborhood is democratic. And the theory says, but also empirical analysis, as soon as you have many countries that are democratic within one region, then you're going to expect a democratic resilience. And the third point that I think is very relevant is ideological moderation, and that's mainly related to a learning process within the left. Mainly leftist actors in the 80s were not very in favor of democracy or had a very particular understanding of democracy. And after the authoritarian regimes, many of these left-wing actors started to be in favor of liberal democracy. The second aspect that I think is extremely interesting is that we have seen a resurgence of the left in Latin America in the last 10 years, but we see fiscal discipline, and that's a completely new development in Latin America. So how can we understand that? And there are mainly two reasons for that. The first reason is a change in the way in which Latin American states obtain their funding. So normally, before the economic crisis of the 80s, Latin American nations obtained funds from commercial banks. And nowadays, they obtain funds from public bond issuance. And that makes a huge difference, because if you obtain your debt from commercial bank lending, what happens is normally there are 4 banks that are going to give me some money, and if I'm going to have a crisis, I'm going to knock the door of these 4 banks. And normally we're going to have an agreement, because these banks are also in serious troubles if they give me the money. What happens when you move to public bond issuance is that I cannot knock the door of 4 banks, because we are talking about millions of different actors that have this bond issuance. And then they can push governments to accept certain austerity measures. And here is just figures showing the change in which Latin American countries obtain lending today. And as you can see in the figure, until the debt crisis of the 80s, commercial bank loans were the main source of funding for Latin American states, and nowadays public bond issuance. And that's one of the main reasons for fiscal discipline in the region nowadays. The second reason is internal support for some of the neoliberal reforms. And of course, most countries were not in favor of these reforms, but after a while what happens is that this reform had certain positive effects, like for example, control of inflation. And because of that, many voters started to say, well, wait a moment, these policies are not excellent, but maybe are not too bad, at least certain aspects of these reforms. The third topic that I think that it's very interesting also for a European perspective is about market reforms and party system stability or instability. And here the main source that I think that is extremely interesting is an American author called Kenneth Roberts, who has been analyzing the role or the impact of market reforms in Latin America, particularly on party system stability. And his argument is that we have to analyze who was responsible for implementing market reforms or austerity measures. And he says that there are 2 different patterns that we can identify in Latin America. The first one is programmatic realignment or alignment, and it's very simple. If you want to implement austerity measures, and a conservative government is going to do that, and left-wing government or left-wing actors or parties are going to be against that, then you're going to have programmatic alignment for the very simple reason that you will expect that. So voters say, okay, if I vote for a right-wing party, it's going to happen what this right-wing party is saying. And if I vote for a left-wing party, this party is going to oppose these measures. But it's much more problematic, it's programmatic de-alignment. And that happened in certain Latin American countries when left-wing actors or populist actors said something during the campaign, but as soon as they came to power, they made a policy switch. And when that happened, that has a terrible impact on the party system, and then you have the alignment. And in fact, many of the countries that have been governed by populist actors are related to this process of programmatic de-alignment. The fourth and last point about Latin America is the issue of crisis of democratic representation and party system collapse. And this point is related to the problem of programmatic de-alignment. And in fact, in those countries in which we have seen a process of programmatic de-alignment, democracy is really under stress in Latin American cases. So the first concept that has been developed to understand that is the one of Mainwaring et al. In a book called Crisis of Democratic Representation in the Andes. And I found it very interesting also to think about these concepts from a European perspective. And what the authors say is that a crisis of democratic representation has 2 dimensions. The first one is a subjective one, and we have talked about that in different panels here, and is through different measures about support or trust in different institutions. For example, political parties, parliament, the Congress, the executive, etc. But the second point, and that's relevant, according to them, you have a crisis of democratic representation only when you have the subjective dimension and also an attitudinal dimension. And this means voters are going to do something different if you compare it with what have been doing them in the past. For example, they're going to vote for populist actors or for political outsiders. So you need these both dimensions together, and then we can really talk about a crisis of democratic representation. Of course, empirically, the main question is where is the threshold? So how much of this subjective dimension and how much of this attitudinal dimension. I don't have time to go into details here, but they develop an idea about that. And the second concept that I think it's also very interesting is the concept of collapse of the party system. And here is mainly an approach developed by Jana Morgan, and she makes a very interesting study about Venezuela, but also in comparative fashion, and she also deals with some European cases. So Italy is in fact a case of collapse of the party system. And she says a collapse of the party system happens when you have two conditions. The first one is that all established or major political parties do not get more than 50% of the vote. So in this sense, it's a very dramatic situation. Imagine a country like the UK, so this means the three major parties or the three existing parties will not get 50% of the vote. Between them together, so to say. And the second one is after that election, you will have a transformation of the party system. So for example, going back to the case of the UK, so you have these three parties, which in fact is like 2.5 party system, and then you have a complete change of the party system because of this new outsider or new party coming into power. So that's the brief summary on the Latin American case, and now let me go briefly to the European case, although I'm not an expert on Europe, but I have like certain ideas, or I think that certain ideas that I have developed for, or summarized for the Latin American experience do travel well for understanding European cases. So the first point is, I think what is at stake in Europe is the defense of liberal democracy and not democracy as such. Someone asked in the first panel, so are we really experiencing a problematic situation in which we can see the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe? And my answer would be no, at least based on the Latin American experience. The crisis was much worse in Latin America, and we haven't seen a collapse of democratic regimes. The only exception, again, is Fujimori. So, and in fact, for example, if you look at data from Eurobarometer and Latino Barometro, so that satisfaction with democracy, if you look, for example, today, and Latin America has pretty solid economic numbers at the moment, and you see democratic satisfaction in Latin America is as bad as in Europe. And we, Latin Americans, we say, okay, it's a bad indicator, but it's not terrible. Well, Europeans are very worried about that. Of course, if you go to Greece, the number is completely different because that's like the average of all European countries. But in this sense, again, I wouldn't worry too much about a collapse of democracy as such in the case of Europe. We know also that Europe is a key player, and if you look at the early transition literature, we know that Europe has played a huge role in the transition to democracy in Southern Europe, but it also in Eastern Europe. But I think that the main problem is that the European Union is not well prepared to deal with countries that now are part of the European Union and start doing certain reforms that are against the rule of law or are against liberal democracy. So the main case here, for example, is Hungary. So, and in this sense, that's the reason that I want to stress that the main problem is liberal democracy as such and not democracy or a minimal concept of democracy. And again, my impression is like the European Union is not very, it's interested in dealing with these cases, but probably has not the mechanisms for dealing in a proper way with these countries. But even in the case of Hungary, I would say the case is not moving toward authoritarianism, it's mainly experienced a process of democratic erosion. So similar, in fact, to what happened in many Latin American countries. The second point that I think that it's interesting, it's about pressures for fiscal discipline in Europe that we are seeing in many countries, and to what extent these pressures are going to lead to a repoliticization of material demands. And we know from the literature on European politics, in fact, Hans-Peter Krisi, that was here a couple of minutes ago, he has published this book, as well as many other authors, on this idea of a new cleavage. And this new cleavage is based on post-materialism, and it's expressed in these two new party families, on the one hand the Greens, and on the other hand the populist radical right. So, but what could happen, in fact, with the implementation of austerity reforms is that not post-material values, but rather material values are going to be much more relevant in the near future. Of course, that's kind of prediction, and we don't know if that's going to be the case or not, but I think what is interesting from the Latin American experience is that there is a great time lag between the rise of an economic crisis and the formation of a radical populist or leftist actors that are going to challenge these austerity measures. And the reason for that is that when you have the crisis, and that was the Latin American experience, most voters said, okay, we have to swallow the bitter pill. So it's terrible what is going on, but we need economic stability. So we are going to vote for mainstream parties that are going to offer stability. And then you have stability, and after 5, 6, 7, 8 years of stability, but no growth, then these parties are going to be much more interesting. Because voters realize, okay, you promised something, you promised stability, but we are not really out of the crisis, we only have stability. So it might be the case that if we are going to see this kind of a rise of repoliticization of material demands, it might take a while in this sense. The third point that I want to develop is about austerity reforms and its impact on the party system in the European Union. The first point is about how should parties react to that. And one of the main lessons from Latin America is that if you are a party in government, and if you have to enact painful reforms, you cannot do it in a way in which you're going to affect your core constituencies and you're going to change your ideological profile. If you're going to do that, your party is going to die, definitely. And in this sense, the main challenge here is, of course, for social democratic parties or social or center-left parties in Europe. So that's in fact what I show with the case of Latin America when you had these experiences of a policy change. So one actor is saying something before the elections, and as soon as it's in power, starts to do exactly the opposite. Then you had this process of political de-alignment. And it might be the case, I mean, we have Greek experts here, so you might tell us about that, but it might be the case that in Greece, for example, that could happen now. I mean, if you think about the previous government that in fact said at the beginning, okay, I'm against these austerity measures, I'm going to do exactly the opposite, and the government didn't have any options. And then you see after the elections that this party did not collapse, but suffered a huge loss of votes. And the third and last point about that is one of the main problems that we can see in Latin America for center of left of center parties is a process of over-adapting. And that happened also in many Latin American countries that said, well, there is no alternative, so we have to accept these neoliberal reforms and are going not to really fight against them. But the most successful cases are those in which parties try to adapt, but at the same time try to develop new policies. And in fact, the most interesting cases are those in which you see alliances between technocrats, kind of progressive technocrats, with actors working in transnational advocacy networks. The best example here is Brazil, the Partido de los Trabajadores, and in fact they developed a new policy which is called conditional cash transfer programs, which was extremely successful. So I cannot go into details here, but that's one example of kind of not going into over-adaptation, but rather trying to develop other policies that might be also very successful. So I go now to the fourth and last point, and that's a question about if some European countries will suffer a crisis of democratic representation and or a collapse of the party system. So the two concepts that I presented before from the Latin American experience. So, and we can see in the case of Europe, it's what I said before, so we see declining trust of European citizens in key institutions. But to a certain extent, I would say that's a healthy development, and that's related to critical citizens. Come on, if you're a European citizen in Spain, of course you're going to be upset with the way in which these institutions are working. The main problem, and that's the theory of Pippa Norris when she talks about critical citizens, you might be dissatisfied with the way in which democracies function, but at the same time you support democracy. Then we are not in troubles. The problem is when citizens are dissatisfied with democracy, but at the same time they are not supporting democracy. And as far as I know for the data in Europe, that's not really the case. What we have is this democratic deficit, much more on the one hand support for democracy, but dissatisfaction with the democratic system. So, and then if we are talking about a crisis of democratic representation, I think the whole point would be we have to think about these two different dimensions I presented before. It's not only about declining trust, it's also about a change in the behavior of voters. And this pattern is, for me, not very clear yet. It might be that it's going to happen later, but as far as I have seen also in the other presentations, it seems that, in fact, mainstream parties are the ones that are being punished on the one hand, but at the same time, if they are punished, they vote for the other mainstream party. So it's not necessarily this attitudinal dimension there. So on the last point to close, I think that also one lesson from Latin America is that what is very, very tricky is doing a major agreement between all political parties. And that's sometimes a solution that some policymakers have proposed, say, okay, imagine that we have to calm the market. So we are going to do a roundtable with all mainstream parties, and then we are going to do a common statement and say we're going to support that policy, these kind of policies. Those Latin American countries that made that normally suffered a collapse of the party system, for the very simple reasons that voters are going to look at those parties and are going to say there is no difference at all. So that kind of solution, it's appealing on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think it's very, very tricky. That's it.